In today's video, I'll be reconstructing the oral tradition behind the Garden of Eden story. The Garden of Eden story raises a number of oddities, including why doesn't it mention God creating the fish? Why does the author use an unusual Hebrew word when writing about the creation of Eve? What does it mean by he will bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel? What does it mean that Eve's desire would be for her husband, but that he would rule over her? Why didn't they die the day that they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What does it mean that Eve had acquired a man? Why does the author use the plural bloods to refer to Abel's blood? And why does the author use Elohim, Yahweh, and Yahweh Elohim in different places? The story also raises a number of questions that it never really answers, including what exactly does it mean to become one flesh? Was it normal for snakes to talk? Didn't the serpent go on its belly before being cursed? Why wasn't Cain's offering accepted? How did he know it wasn't accepted? And what exactly was the mark of Cain? And in today's video, I'll be proposing an approach to the text that answers all of these questions. Emmanuel Louis writes, prominent critical scholars have found numerous duplicates and contradictions and attributed these to two strands or two traditions or to two sources. But if a redactor tried to harmonize conflicting traditions or sources, the question arises, why did he not do a better job? And my answer to that question is because it was written as propaganda. And what that means is that the biblical author took elements from an oral tradition and put them into a new context to change their meaning in order to fit the agenda of the biblical author. This creates ambidextrous text, which is text that fits in both the biblical narrative and the oral tradition. By isolating this text, we can reconstruct the oral tradition, and that's what I'll be doing today, is reconstructing that oral tradition. Before we get started, I'll go over the characters that were in the oral tradition, which are Eve, Elohim, the serpent, Adamah, Cain, and Abel. You may notice that Yahweh is not on this list, and that Adam is not on this list, and that Cain and Abel are on this list, even though they weren't really part of the Garden of Eden narrative. Okay, so the first character we're going to look at is Eve. And Eve was a goddess in the oral tradition. Delansky writes, here in Eden we have all of these goddess associations, but no goddess. We have an interesting term in Genesis 2:18, which is translated helper. This word usually refers to divine assistance, often referring to God helping Israel. This could be a word carried over from the oral tradition, where Eve was divine. The tree of life was Eve. They were one and the same. The name Eve audibly resembles life or living in the Hebrew, so the tree of life is the tree of Eve. This is not uncommon in the ancient Near East, where a number of goddesses were associated with trees or were themselves trees, one of them being Asherah, which is mentioned in the Bible. Since wisdom was associated with the divine, Eve was wise from the beginning in the oral tradition. The biblical narrative splits off this aspect of Eve by making the tree of knowledge of good and evil the source of the wisdom. When describing the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is awkwardly tacked on to the end of the verse, indicating that it was a new addition in the biblical narrative that was different from the oral tradition. And this brings us to our first propaganda technique, the literal figurative switcheroo. This technique takes something that was literal in the oral tradition and makes it figurative in the biblical narrative. In this case, in the oral tradition, Eve was a goddess, but the biblical narrative changes it to become like God, using a simile. Which leads us to our next propaganda technique, which is a plausible misunderstanding. The biblical author couldn't just make anything up. He had to give the original reader a plausible misunderstanding. Oh, you thought Eve was a goddess? No. She was just like a god. So Eve does become human eventually, and I will get to that later as we go through the narrative of the oral tradition. Our next character in the oral tradition is Elohim. Now, the word Elohim is technically a title, not a name, but regardless, Elohim is the word used in the oral tradition to refer to this god. And in the oral tradition, Elohim was a storm god. And we see some obvious examples in Genesis where Elohim had not sent the rain yet in the beginning of the narrative. Cursing the ground is related to rain. And finally, in the flood, Elohim floods the earth with rain. There are a couple of other places in the text that may refer to a storm god, one of them being Genesis 3:8, where it talks about Elohim walking in the garden in the cool of the day. This could be translated as the following. Then the man and his wife heard the thunder of Yahweh God as he was going back and forth in the garden in the wind of the storm, and they hid from Yahweh God among the trees of the garden. Another instance is in Genesis 3:24, where it refers to the flaming sword. This could be translated to refer to a lightning bolt. Elohim was the husband of Eve, which leads us to our next propaganda technique, which I call the redundant lie. This is where the biblical author unnecessarily repeats a claim in order to change the narrative. In this case, Adam and Eve are referred to as husband and wife 7 times, which implies that Adam and Eve were not husband and wife. But if Adam wasn't Eve's husband, then who was? The character Elohim seems to be the best fit in the oral tradition. Elohim was in the oral tradition, Yahweh was not. Some scholars see the composite divine name as redactional, with Yahweh being in the earlier form and Elohim added later. I would agree with this, except that I believe that Elohim was in the oral tradition and Yahweh is added by the biblical author. One of the reasons I think this is because that it uses the propaganda technique that I call begging the answer. This is where the biblical author asks a question and then answers it differently than it would have been in the oral tradition. In Genesis 3:1, it says, "Has Elohim really said?" This is the biblical author anticipating a question by the original reader. In the oral tradition, the original reader would not have heard Elohim say, "You shall not eat from any tree of the garden." So the biblical author here anticipates that question and then answers it in the affirmative. Associating Yahweh with a storm god is not unique to the Garden of Eden narrative. Psalm 29 is probably one of the more discussed, where some believe that it was originally a hymn to Baal, but was then changed to Yahweh. Our next character is the serpent. The serpent was also a god. The biblical narrative seems to try to shift away from this by emphasizing that the serpent is just another beast of the field. We also have an ambidextrous word used in reference to the serpent. Gordon Wenham points out that wisdom was often associated with snakes in the ancient Near East. Klaus Westermann points it out as well. But the word used in the biblical narrative can be translated as shrewd or as wise. The context in the biblical narrative seems to indicate that it should be interpreted shrewd more than wise. But if this word was used in the oral tradition and the serpent was a god, then wise would be a better translation. So just like the biblical author has Eve lose her wisdom, the serpent also loses his wisdom as the biblical narrative shifts them away from being deities. The serpent as a god also makes better sense as to why he can talk. And it makes better sense of the curses, which I'll get into later. Our next character is Adamah, and Adamah was an earth goddess. Now the name Adamah doesn't occur in the biblical narrative, but the word Adamah does, and it's usually translated earth, dirt, soil, or ground. We have another literal figurative switcheroo technique used in Genesis 4:11, which it uses personification in relation to Adamah. And in the oral tradition, Adamah was cursed. The biblical narrative keeps this element and never directly curses Adam, but rather attributes the cursing of the ground to Adam. So these gods and goddesses seem to be very primitive in the sense that Eve was a tree, Elohim was a storm, the serpent was a serpent, and Adamah was the ground. This is one of the reasons I think the oral tradition is very old, much older than the biblical narrative. Okay, so with those characters in mind, let's take a look at the narrative of the oral tradition. The first question we need to ask is, who planted the garden? Obviously, in the biblical narrative, Yahweh Elohim plants the garden and creates the vegetation. But with other gods and goddesses in the oral tradition, this gives us more options, one of them being Adamah. It is out of Adamah that the trees spring up from, raising the possibility that in the oral tradition, Adamah had a part in the creation. Eve also is an option. She was the mother of all living. In the biblical narrative, the universal term of all is constrained to that of the human race. But in the oral tradition, there may have been no such constraint. We also see something similar in terms of the creation of the animals. Again, it is out of Adamah that the animals are created. But the biblical author makes a heavy emphasis on Yahweh Elohim creating the animals, both in the garden and later in the flood narrative. This could be another redundant lie, indicating that Elohim did not create the animals. I'm proposing that Adamah created the animals and the vegetation by using life from Eve. This requires us to rethink what the tree of life was in the oral tradition. Was it the origin of all life, or did it give one eternal life? Obviously, the biblical narrative wants us to think that it gave eternal life. But as I'll show later, it seemed to have been the origin of all life in the oral tradition. Having other gods in the oral tradition also answers the question, where are the fish? In the biblical narrative, Yahweh Elohim only creates the land animals and the vegetation, but no fish. The oral tradition can explain this because Elohim was a storm god and Adamah was an earth god, neither of them being a sea god, which would have been the one who created the fish. Another interesting aspect in the creation of the animals in the biblical narrative is that we're told 3 times in one paragraph that Adam named the animals. This would indicate another redundant lie and opens up the possibility of either Adamah or Eve naming the animals. This brings us to our only purely human character in the story, and that is Cain. And Cain was Adam. Or more precisely, there was no Adam in the oral tradition. The word Adam simply means man, and the name Adam is a construct of the biblical author. But in the oral tradition, there was only one man, and his name was Cain. There are some interesting parallels between Cain and Adam in the biblical narrative. Yahweh Elohim forms Adam from the dust of the ground, whereas Cain is a worker of the ground. Adam is driven out of the garden, and Cain is driven away from the face of Yahweh. Adam shall rule over Eve, and Cain must rule over it, whatever it is. That verse seems to be very corrupt, with all translations not making much sense. However, there does seem to be a personification in this verse, and with our earlier personification referring to Adamah, it makes me wonder if this also indeed referred to Adamah as well. Adam hid himself from God, and Cain was hidden from the face of Yahweh. So who created the man in the oral tradition? Well, I think it's safe to say that Elohim did not create the man. That's because there seems to be another redundant lie, where the biblical narrative emphasizes Elohim forming and creating the man, both in the garden narrative and also in the flood narrative. But I'm proposing that Adamah created the man, whose name was Cain. Just like the animals and the vegetation, man was also taken from Adamah. Drew Johnson notes that he generally translates the Adam as the dirtling. It's not actually his name, it's a title meant to reflect where the man came from. Indeed, he came from Adamah, and in the oral tradition, Adamah was a goddess. So, similar to the creation of the animals in the oral tradition, a life or branch was taken from Eve to create Cain, but the biblical author flips the narrative on this process and has a rib taken from Adam to create Eve. However, we still have some hints from the oral tradition that are in the biblical narrative, which are the words for ribs and for built. The Hebrew word for rib could be translated rib or side, or maybe even life. In Sumerian, rib and life sound similar, but most see this as far-fetched since it would presuppose an extraordinary knowledge of Sumerian by a Hebrew writer. Some scholars propose a blind motif in that the connection between rib and life had become part of the culture, so even though the pun doesn't work in Hebrew, the connection was still there. The word is usually translated rib instead of side because it's one of many. But this one of many factor works with Eve too. It could have been one of her lives, and it could have been one of her sides, or branches. Joel Baden talks about taking a cutting in his article An Unnoted Nuance in Genesis 2:21-22, where he notes this is a technique that produces a second plant that is effectively a clone of the original. And the process of taking a cutting may remove part of the original plant, but it leaves no permanent damage. The second interesting term in the creation description is built. The word used for built is only used here and in Amos 9:6 in terms of creation, although in Akkadian and Ugaritic it's a regular term that is used for creation. Klaus Westermann points out the same thing. But what if Adam was built with wood? Not that he was made of wood like Pinocchio, but rather his life originated from a tree. Joel Baden notes that the language of building plays well with sila, the word for rib, which is often used to refer to an architectural feature of the tabernacle or the temple. Cain was a slave of Adamah. Even in the biblical narrative, the man is there to do work. In Genesis 4:2, it says, Cain, a worker of the ground. That word for worker is interesting, as it has connotations to slavery. And with just a couple tweaks, Cain, a worker of the ground, becomes Cain, a slave of Adamah. Furthermore, Sauter writes, in the ancient Near East, tattoos were used to mark slaves. Often the name of a slave's owner would be tattooed or branded on his hand or forehead. If then the slave were to run away, he could easily be returned to his master. Thus, tattooing was seen as a sign of ownership. And so, in Genesis 4:15, we have Yahweh putting a mark on Cain. This mark in the oral tradition could have been a slave tattoo. Eve bought Cain. In Genesis 4:1, Eve says, I have acquired a man with the help of Yahweh. This phrase is difficult to interpret, including the meaning of acquired. It's also weird that a baby boy is referred to as a man, and the tying in of Yahweh is very strange. In Exodus 21:2, it's used in reference to acquiring a Hebrew slave. It's typically translated acquired, produced, created, or procreated. As I'll discuss later in the narrative, all of these translations fit better in the oral tradition than they do in the biblical narrative. It's also interesting that the biblical author feels the need to say that Cain was conceived and bore, but only to say that his brother Abel was bore, but doesn't mention anything about conception. Eve and Cain fell in love. If Eve was the wife of Elohim, then the biblical author would have had to repurpose the words naked and ashamed. This could also explain why they hid themselves from the presence of Elohim. The serpent turned Eve into a human. I haven't been able to discern much about the process of Eve transitioning to human, and I think maybe that process may have been conflated with the creation of Adam. However, when the man says, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, in the oral tradition referred to when Eve transitioned from goddess to human. In this case, man was taken out of woman, but in the biblical narrative, woman was taken out of man. This seems to be in addition to the words spoken by Adam, and it could explain why the second line is rhythmically different than the first line. In Genesis 2:24, it says, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. This is typically interpreted to mean a married couple becoming one in spirit, which is the opposite of what the text actually says. I think Craig Keener comes closest to what the biblical author was shooting for, and saying that when a woman marries into a family, she becomes part of that bloodline. However, in the oral tradition, becoming one flesh referred to when Eve became human and finally had the same flesh as Cain. It appears that this transition of Eve from tree to human has remnants in the text. In Genesis 3:7, they're wearing fig leaves, and in Genesis 3:21, they have garments of skin, paralleling this transition from a tree to a human. The animal skins that God provides can literally be translated for their skin. This is also interesting because the serpent sheds its skin, which could have played a role in the oral tradition. It also puts a different spin on the "you shall surely die" phrase in Genesis 2:17. If Eve had transitioned from goddess to human, she would have lost her immortality. And the warning that they would surely die if they ate of the fruit could have been the biblical author trying to get away from the goddess immortality aspect. The serpent impregnated Eve. There are a couple words in the biblical narrative that could have sexual connotations. Obviously, in the biblical narrative, they are not meant to be taken sexually, but if they're put into a different context, such as the oral tradition, it could indicate that the serpent was naked and also that he seduced Eve. This may also explain the odd emphasis of how beautiful the trees were. As Genesis 2:9 explains, they were pleasant to the sight, and in Genesis 3:6 says that the tree of knowledge was a delight to the eyes. The biblical author utilizes a propaganda technique found elsewhere in the Bible, in that in order to remove sexual connotations, the husband is placed with the woman. This is also found in Judges 13, when Samson's mother, who had sex with a sun god in the oral tradition, the biblical author has her tell her husband immediately, and the pregnancy is turned into a prophecy. Elohim cursed Adamah. In the oral tradition, it appears that Adamah had something to do with the pregnancy of Eve. She is therefore cursed. As a side note, Genesis 3:18 could be translated, "Thorns and thistles will eat up the plants of the field," instead of referring to Adam eating the plants of the field. I think this makes more sense both in the biblical narrative and also in the oral tradition. Elohim cursed Eve. To the woman he said, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children." This makes sense in the oral tradition because Eve, as a goddess, would not have had pain during the creation process. It's also interesting that the word used for pain here is not the typical word used for pain during childbirth. It seems to be deliberately chosen as a pun on tree. In the biblical narrative, this refers to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but in the oral tradition, this refers to Eve as a tree. "Your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you." In the oral tradition, this makes sense because Eve was a goddess who ruled over Cain the slave. As a human, she no longer has that status. Elohim cursed the serpent. "On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life." In the biblical narrative, this is odd because snakes generally go on their bellies, and if they didn't before the curse, then how did they get around? In the oral tradition, this is solved because the serpent was a god. The phrase "dust you shall eat" does not necessarily have to be taken literally. This could be translated as figurative for abject humiliation, especially of enemies. The curse continues, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring." In the biblical narrative, this is an attempt to explain our general dislike for snakes. And all of this leads us to our final character, Abel. Abel was the offspring of the serpent and Eve. Abel was the demigod, half god, half human. Cain and Abel were not brothers. This, again, is a redundant lie. We are told in the biblical narrative that Cain and Abel are brothers 7 times, which indicates that they were not brothers in the oral tradition. Cain did not kill Abel. This, again, is a redundant lie and indicates that Cain did not kill Abel in the oral tradition. "He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." The choice of head and heel here still remains a bit of a mystery, but it describes well the conflict between the offspring of Cain and the offspring of the serpent. The phrase implies repeated attacks by both sides to injure the other. It declares lifelong mutual hostility between mankind and the serpent race. In the oral tradition, the serpent race was the offspring of the serpent god. In Genesis 4:10, it says, "And Yahweh said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." The word blood there is actually plural and should read, "Your brother's bloods are crying out to me from the ground." When this plural of the word blood occurs elsewhere in the Bible, as in Isaiah or Hosea, it stands for violently shed blood that must be avenged, something like the phrase rivers of blood. So this appears to be a remnant from the oral tradition where there was a war between the offspring of Cain and the offspring of the serpent. The biblical narrative attempts to change the explanation for this violence by making man's heart evil from his youth. Killing the serpent's descendants brought rain from Elohim. In Genesis 4:3-4, it talks about the ground opening its mouth when Abel's blood is spilled. This could also explain why Cain's offering was not accepted. After the curse, the only offering accepted by Elohim was the blood of the serpent's offspring. This could also explain how Cain knew his offering wasn't accepted. There was no rain. The phrase, "If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold," could have been a warning from Elohim against the descendants of the serpent. Likewise, the phrase, "If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times," could have been a warning from Adamah. It appears that Lamech did not actually say the phrase. There is emphasis in the biblical narrative that Lamech had said it, amounting to another redundant lie. Also, Lamech refers to himself in the third person. When it says, "You are cursed from the ground," from the Adamah, this could have been an allusion to the oral tradition where Adamah had cursed Cain. This would also explain why Cain was a fugitive and a wanderer of the earth, which the biblical narrative re-explains as Yahweh's curse against him. It's interesting as we get to the narrative about Cain in the Bible that Elohim is suddenly dropped from the narrative. Only Yahweh is used to refer to God. This could be because much of the Cain narrative is fabricated, or it could be to put some distance between the storm god and the lack of rain. Elohim kills all of the serpent's descendants with a flood. The oral tradition climaxes when Noah seems to be the last of the descendants of Cain. Elohim then sends rain to flood the earth and kill all of the descendants of the serpent. It's only after the flood that Noah is described as being a man of the soil. In the oral tradition, this would have referred to as being a descendant of Cain. But in the biblical narrative, it's changed to mean that he planted a vineyard. Alright, so I just wanted to mention a few things about the oral tradition itself. I think it was also propaganda. This is a difficult thing to do because it's essentially a reconstruction of a reconstruction, so there's only little bits we can piece together. But ultimately, I think the oral tradition was Kenite propaganda. Cain is the namesake of the tribe of the Kenites. The name Cain is best explained, I think, in terms of smith or metalworker, but in the biblical narrative, it's explained in terms of acquired. But this doesn't seem to be a creation of the biblical narrative, and it seems to have been original in the oral tradition. Overall, the story seems very pro-Cain. I mean, he literally married a goddess, and it explains his slave history in the best way possible. He wasn't just an ordinary slave, he was a slave of a goddess. And also, he did not kill his brother. This is an addition of the biblical narrative, not the oral tradition. So overall, Cain looks very good in this story. Also, elsewhere in the Bible, when it talks about some kind of genocide, this is not hyperbole. It's propaganda, and it's meant to assimilate some tribe into a greater tribe. So usually it's trying to assimilate some tribe into Israel. There may have been some people amongst the population that were from a different tribe, and the propaganda was like, well, you can't be from that tribe because they were totally annihilated, so you must be an Israelite. And so this increases the integrity of Israel. And by integrity, I mean, they're all Israelites. So I think there may be something similar in the Garden of Eden narrative, and that there were Abelites still amongst the Cainites, and the Cainites wanted to assimilate them. So they came up with this genocide story of the flood in order to eliminate any possibility of being an Abelite. Another aspect of propaganda is the elimination of a goddess. Elsewhere in the Bible, other gods are eliminated in favor of Yahweh. Usually they're not blatantly eliminated. Usually they're combined identities with Yahweh. But here in the oral tradition of the Garden of Eden narrative, Eve is transitioned from a goddess to a human. This gets rid of the goddess that may have been competing with a Canaanite goddess or gods. So I think this is all further evidence that the Canaanite hypothesis is wrong. Recently I wrote in a blog post, almost all instances of Canaanites in the Bible seem to be trying to convince the reader that they were part of the Midianites, which is a typical tale of biblical propaganda. So I don't think Yahweh originated with the Cainites, because Yahweh seems to be an injection by the biblical author in a story that was originally Canaanite. I also think this story had southern origins, and the location seems to be changed in the Bible. They want to put the garden in Eden. We're repeatedly told that it's in Eden. Where Eden is, it's not really sure, but it doesn't seem to be in southern Judea. And if you look closely at the other mentions of Eden or the garden narrative elsewhere in the Bible, it does kind of seem to be describing a different narrative. Some see the bringing together of two traditions on this point. One example being the cherubim guarding the garden, and the other being the flickering flame of a sword guarding the garden, and that these may have been from two different garden stories. And one last thing I wanted to mention was the often asked question of where did Cain get his wife? If there were no other humans around, where would he get his wife from? And I think this is best explained by the concept that the ancients thought that their original ancestor was created by their god. And if you were a different ethnicity, their ancestor, or your ancestor, was created by a different god. And so there wasn't this idea of a one man created for all humans. Each ethnicity had their own Adam, so to speak. I recently did a blog post on Job and how I think Job was the original Adam for the god El, and that it was also an origin of man's story. But there also seems to be other ethnicities in that story, and so I think it's best explained by this concept of each man was created by each god. This also explained Cain's fear of someone finding him and killing him. That's because there were other ethnicities around that were created by other gods. The priestly source, I think, tries to get away from this, not only describing fountains of the great deep bursting open in order to get away from the storm god, but also emphasizing that all flesh died. This is to include all ethnicities and to eliminate all atoms, so to speak, that were created by other gods. All right, that is it for this video. I hope you like it. If you have any questions, be sure to reach out to me. You can comment below, or you can reach out to me on Twitter. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.